Hello together. Today I'm going to take up a different topic than usual. Vaccination has become a very emotional topic, especially the COVID-19 vaccination. It is admirable how scientists managed to develop a series of highly effective vaccines against the SARS-CoV-2 virus within less than a year. Above all, a new type of vaccine, based on mRNA, made a lot of talk. Critics complain that this method has not been tested enough, although research has been carried out on it for at least 20 years. Nonetheless, the two vaccines in this category are among the earliest approved in many European countries. And in contrast to the equally widespread vector vaccines like the one from AstraZeneca, there have been fewer reports of serious side effects. To anticipate it, I have been vaccinated since February of this year with 2 doses of the Moderna mRNA vaccine. Some people around me have also been vaccinated with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. My own experience was that I had no problems at all with my first dose, and neither did anyone else at the vaccination center. The second injection 4 weeks later resulted in 2 days of fever and chills, but that was about it. This side effect is not uncommon and indicates an immune system that has been stimulated. But why did I get vaccinated? Contrary to the opinion of certain social circles, that we who have been vaccinated are all government believers without our own will, all of the people around me did not take the vaccination because they trust the government so much. No, it is rather a trust in the achievements of conventional medicine, the progress of which is unfortunately only too gladly ignored. Nobody was interested in lifestyle either. If that were the point, I would be the last person to get vaccinated, as I'm naturally Asperger's autist, and therefore certainly anything but a party tiger. I was also never particularly afraid of being infected with the virus. No, I did it because I believe it is the right thing to do. Because I use it to protect the people around me. And because I can contribute to what is known as herd immunity. I'm by no means a supporter of the government, which did some good things in advance, but also produced a lot of nonsense. What concerns me more is the question of how such an mRNA-based vaccine works. As everyone knows, mRNA, which is short for messenger RNA, is the herald of the cell. This herald gets its information directly from the cell nucleus, for which small sections of the genetic material, the genes, are detached from their double helix and copied. There are lots of little helpers, so-called enzymes, that control the various processes. The genetic material in the cell nucleus consists, as is well known, of DNA that is bound in a double helix. It is a central database. The differences between DNA and RNA are initially minor, and include a different sugar in the polymer structure and a different base. But apart from that, they are compatible. Basically, the RNA is simply the negative of the gene's DNA. And once this strand of RNA is completed, it is sent on its way to the cell's factories. That is the mRNA. The biologist calls these factories the ribosomes. And as the name suggests, these also consist of ribonucleic acid, which have formed into lumpy structures. They are also called rRNA or ribosomal RNA. As in any decent factory, there are various machines and an army of specialized workers. Of course, these are mostly protein-based molecules. The mRNA docks and becomes an assembly line. The third group of RNA, the tRNA or transfer RNA, belongs to the most important workers. This is shaped like a strange pretzel and has an area that reads the code. This code consists of 3 bases each, and depending on the combination, one of 20 amino acids, the beginning of the chain or the end of the chain, is added. There is therefore a special tRNA for every possible combination, and this in turn, transports the respective amino acid. Other skilled workers, again based on enzymes, now combine the individual amino acids to form the protein. Finally, in order to make it effective, it also receives its secondary and tertiary structure. The new protein is finally released into the cell. Viruses are known to use our production system for the purpose of their own reproduction. They infiltrate the cell, the infiltration proceeding differently depending on the virus type. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, it is a virus with positive stranded ssRNA. This means that this RNA can be used directly as mRNA. It is therefore not surprising that vaccination with mRNA is particularly suitable for this virus. Admittedly, there are also problems with handling mRNA. One of the problems is primarily how to get this into a cell. The virus attaches to the cell and uses an opening mechanism. So-called vector vaccines use existing viral envelopes to penetrate cells. A different route was chosen for the mRNA vaccines. Both Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines use the same material that cell membranes are made of to coat the mRNA. The so-called phospholipids consist of a polar head and an apolar alkyl radical. They can form spherical structures with polar ends both inside and outside, while the inner and outer lipids are held together by the van der Waals forces of the long fatty acid chains. These spherical structures have long been used as liposomes, especially in cosmetics. Packed in a liposome, the mRNA can enter the cell. And once the mRNA has entered the cell, it reaches the ribosomes directly by infiltrating the actual service route. But what is actually produced using this mRNA? It is one of the so-called spike proteins. The spikes are the protrusions on the surface of the virus, exposed structures for which the body can produce antibodies if they are made known to it. These spike proteins migrate to the surface of the cell and are put through their paces by the immune system. Since it is something foreign, the structure is added to the database of the immune system. This now produces antibodies that can recognize this structure. Far more significant as a technical problem. Because of the high instability of the mRNA, the vaccines have to be stored at low temperatures. The problem is particularly high with the vaccine from Pfizer-BioNTech, as it has to be stored at -70 centigrade. Therefore, it is usually only given in special vaccination centers. The storage temperature of the Moderna vaccine of -20 centigrade, on the other hand, must also be maintained with conventional cooling devices. In addition to the argument that this procedure has not been tested enough, there are also much more irrational fears. Such is the fear that the mRNA vaccine will rewrite our genome. But this does not actually happen with this procedure, because the cell nucleus is not affected at all. The effectiveness of the two mRNA vaccines is estimated at around 95%. This also has to do with the fact that not every immune system works equally well. It is remarkable how every single case in which a fully vaccinated person dies of corona is misused by opponents as evidence of the uselessness of the vaccination. Undoubtedly, these people apparently did not understand the importance of 95%, and their mendacity often also consists in the fact that, in their opinion, every unvaccinated person does not die of corona, but because of other diseases or old age. This cruel view is stupid and inhuman and multiple disproven by studies. It is also deliberately ignored that it is precisely those who oppose the vaccination that subvert any attempt to achieve what is known as herd immunity. With the original corona variants, this would be achieved if those who have recovered and who have been vaccinated together made up 70% of the population. In the case of the Delta variant, it unfortunately looks like that, even with 100% immunized, herd immunity can no longer be achieved. This means that even with a full vaccination, additional measures should not be dispensed with. Many politicians now believe that the will to vaccinate can be strengthened if a vector vaccine is also offered instead of the mRNA vaccines that are criticized. That sounds reasonable at first, but I doubt that they will achieve anything with it. Because the rejection of the mRNA vaccines is basically a pseudo-rationalization. It is fundamentally about the fact that many people want to give their strange view a scientific coating in order to pass as enlightened fellow citizens. Obviously, the same people will soon find reservations about vector vaccines. I'm aware that this topic is discussed in a highly emotional and hateful manner. Therefore, it is certainly important first of all to deal with who these vaccine opponents actually are. Indeed, there are a number of studies. First of all, unsurprising, there are the usual suspects, anti-technology circles, conspiracy theorists and fundamentalist religious and esoteric movements. But what is more astonishing is that a study from 2018 also found that the number of trypanophobes and hematophobes, that is people who are afraid of injections or blood, is higher than the norm. Here too, a way is sought to conceal their weaknesses and to bring seemingly rational reasons against vaccination. So there is primarily a social problem here. Our performance society does not tolerate weakness, which forces some to trick their way through in one way or another. As an autistic person, I know this all too well, especially since I had to survive 40 years of my life without diagnosis in an absolutely hostile setting. And who hasn't occasionally resorted to a protective mechanism in order not to embarrass themselves in front of their fellow human beings? The fault does not lie in the people with weaknesses, but in society's way of dealing with them. If people with phobias were not simply stigmatized and laughed at, but their problems were taken seriously, and they were respected as full-fledged people, they would not have to resort to crude pseudo-rationalizations. Neither politics nor the churches have a refined sense of people's worries and fears, and then complain that these people are drifting away from the establishment and joining radical movements. Even worse, they devalue the people who were first pushed to make this decision through social ostracism. Of course, this is where the rogue comes into play, who listens to these people, who pretends that their concerns are his too. It is clear to the outsider that these are Pied Piper, sectarian, and profiteer. For those affected, however, it is a community in which they feel secure and understood. As a social outsider, I can understand this to some extent, even if, as Asperger's, I hardly feel the need to socialize. But it's nice to have someone with whom you feel understood. But now comes the famous but. Because not all vaccination opponents are people who have joined because of their weaknesses. A study by the German agency com.passion provided an unexpected surprise, which looked at whether social milieus borrowed from the Sigma study have an influence on the rejection of vaccinations. For this purpose, behavior in social networks was analyzed. While the conservative, established bourgeoisie make up 8.6% of those who are against vaccinations and the traditional workers only 3.4%. In the liberal intellectual milieu there is an astonishingly high proportion of 31% who refuse to be vaccinated. The concentration of anti-vaxxers in this group is 3 times higher than the average. It is frightening that of all people, a social group that is practically completely academic shows such a high level of rejection of vaccination. Incidentally, the same milieu that characterizes the Friday for Future demonstrations. The leftist German politician Sarah Wagenknecht describes this group as the lifestyle leftists. For one thing, they preach water, but when their own lifestyle is in jeopardy, these hipsters drink wine. Well, Sarah Wagenknecht unfortunately also attracts attention because of the content that is critical of the vaccination. This scene grew up from the 68s and the subsequent opposition to nuclear power. The Green Party grew out of these movements. Unfortunately, here too, as all too often, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and what they considered to be a rationally justified criticism gave rise to a profound hostility towards science. Mainstream medicine in particular fell victim to this approach, and in these social circles it is en vogue to be treated with alternative methods. Not to mention that this is bad in every case. Interesting is another part of the study showing that there exist 3 clusters of vaccination opponents, according to the combination with other interests they have. Often the groups are overlapping. I'm aware that by a long way not every Green is a vaccination opponent, but of course the Green parties are also aware that, after the classic right-wing populist protest parties, of course, they have the highest proportion of anti-vaccination candidates in their electorate. This has nothing to do with the party itself, but has to do with the milieu from which a majority of its voters originate. As academics, they act as the carriers of science. Their climate youth pretend that they think highly of science and deny scientific thinking to anyone who doesn't share their view of world. In truth, however, their love of science is limited to a small area, climate prognosis, while the rest of science, at best, they don't give a shit or rather deeply hate them, because they deny science any ability to find solutions to combat climate change. No, they even twist it in such a way that science demands a massive restriction of their freedoms from the population in their favor. Science is thus placed in a role that it neither assumes nor wants to assume. It is all the more twisted that other members of the same milieu go to the barricades against the restriction of their freedom. I can still understand if they feel that measures are unnecessary. It happened to me too, that I was unable to sympathize with a number of government measures, especially when they were apparently distorted by lobbying. But that's not what most rioters are after. They don't like the fact that now, in the wake of the increasing vaccination rate, the certificate requirement has been introduced in many countries. Also, those who have not yet vaccinated should now pay for the tests themselves in order to receive a certificate. The governments hope that this will create a gentle pressure that will induce some more moderate vaccine objectors to get vaccinated after all. It is also the case that now, albeit reluctantly, many have decided to vaccinate. But the hardcore has also become radicalized. They warn here, although many of them, as we now know, belong to the upper class of society, against the emergence of a two-class society. There are now excesses of violence, even murders have occurred, and politicians have almost got used to the daily death threats and shameful mails. I have the admittedly subjective impression that these rebels, despite their constant violation of the law, are being treated with kid gloves. The same applies to the illegal actions of the climate youth. At the same time, other protest movements are often nipped in the bud very quickly, no matter how justified their concerns are. The bottom line is that these people are treated with respect because they belong to the new upper class, while one likes to trample on the concerns of the disabled. To anticipate any polemical comments, I do not belong to the right-wing political spectrum, but belong to the classic left segment. I come from the working class and do not have a higher school diploma. I also live in a rather rural area, which of course shapes my attitude in many aspects. But I don't belong to the political right. I'm just not a lifestyle leftist. My personal opinion, completely independent of politics or other worldviews, is that everyone who vaccinates actively helps the fight against the currently greatest enemy of mankind, SARS-CoV-2. It is clear that vaccination cannot save everyone, and a very small number of people will experience even more severe side effects. But it is also the case that not everyone can stand strawberries, but nobody would want to do without strawberries in the first place. And this is about much more than enjoyment. It is about fighting a pandemic, about reclaiming terrain that we have lost to the disease in the last year and a half. On the other hand, it is questionable whether we will ever achieve normality again. Perhaps we also have to redefine the term normality. Not everything we have learned during this time is bad, so the measures against corona also meant that there was no flu epidemic last winter. So why not counteract future flu waves with certain measures? We should finally realize that it is by no means a human right to infect others with one's own viruses in public spaces. So, please have more faith in the performance of science, and don't just look to its failures. Think altruistic and give the vaccination a chance. For all the people who really cannot be vaccinated by medical reasons. We do it not just for ourselves, we do it for the whole mankind. Please stay healthy, your Herbert.